We're ready to rock? Awesome. So before we get started today, I want to take a moment to just thank all of you for having me in your home. This is a beautiful town here in Dryden, and I'll get to where I'm from, but I'll start with when I got on the airplane to come here. It was 25 degrees Celsius, and I did not pack a hat. And I want you to imagine this morning a fresh out of the shower bald man walking here in the permafrost, and what that looked like when I got here. And it got worse. The faster I walked, the more sweaty I got, and the more frost started forming on my head. And it was a good welcome to Dryden. Apparently, the winter starts a little earlier over here. Before we get to me, I want to introduce the wonderful panel that the city's put forward for you. In addition to thanking the people of Treaty 3, Wabigoon Lake First Nation, Eagle Lake First Nation for having us here on the unceded territory of the Treaty 3 people. And I'm going to get, again, to a little bit of what it means to have proper Indigenous consultation as part of my anecdote. But before me, I'm just going to go down the line, and then I'll jump to the people on camera, if we can put them up there as well. So right next to me, I have Nancy Greencorn. She is with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. I don't have her position. I believe you're the vice president, right? No, director. Sorry, it's not listed here. No kidding. On her right, I have Eric. Eric is the Director of Transportation and Licensing Strategic Support. Beside Eric, I have Brenane. She is with Northwatch and We the Free Nuclear North, or Nuclear Free North. My apologies, Brenane. Beside her, I have Joe Hale, Senior Engagement Advisor for the North Nuclear Waste Management Organization. And then on the end, I have Dr. Peter Ottensmeyer. I would like to read Dr. Peter Ottensmeyer's credentials, just in case you missed them earlier today. He is a Bachelor in Science in Engineering Physics and Metallurgy, Master's in Solid State Physics, and a PhD in Medical Biophysics, former Chair of Medical Biophysics at the University of Toronto, and Senior Scientist at the Ontario Cancer Institute. We are very lucky to have Dr. Ottensmeyer here with us today. In support, in the wings, I guess I will let them introduce themselves as they come on screen. Some of them wanted to be a little bit more in a support role, but I will introduce Kimberly Mitchell, who we all met this morning, as our keynote panelist. She's been working with nuclear utility sector, and she's a very prominent role model of mine with her work with as an advocate for First Nations people. And that brings me to me. I grew up by a hill in Calgary, Alberta, and I have driven the road beside that hill more times than I can count in the very short 24 years that I've been alive. And where I'm going with that is you could probably hit me on the head and blindfold me, put me in the back of a car, and if you drove up that hill, I would be able to tell almost exactly where I was. And on this hill, very similar to the one that I met in Dryden on my walk down here this morning, are a bunch of deer that like to walk on the sidewalk and do not care much for the cars driving by. And I know the exact corner on that hill where these deer like to hang out and where they will walk on that road, and the exact time of day that it'll happen. And so every time I drive down that road, I have my foot on the brake when I get to the southwest corner of Nose Hill. And when I was 16, driving down the road where I go to work, where I saved my money for my Ford Mustang that I bought, that I was driving, and someone was driving beside me in a car that was designed, like engineered perfectly. The safety was, it couldn't be refuted. The rules of the road can't be refuted. But they didn't know what I knew about my hill. And so when the deer came out on the road, they swerved into me, and I totaled my Mustang. And there's something to be said about all of you sitting in this room that grew up here and live here in Dryden and raised kids in Dryden, that there is a hill here for you, like mine at home. And you know something about that hill that all of us don't know. And so the spirit of me being here is exactly that. I want to make sure that your voice regarding your hill, what you know about this place, is heard and heard honestly. And so the City of Dryden put forward the opportunity to submit questions, and I've kind of compiled those questions and put them together to be presented to this panel. I've organized them in a way to make sure that they go to the right person at the right time. And without further ado, I want to get into it because I want to leave a lot of time at the end for open question and answer. Yes? Oh, Carrie as well, sorry. Carrie Blaze is also in support up top. I missed her biography at the bottom here as well, but she's with the Canadian Environmental Law Association and the Northern Services Legal Council. Carrie is going to be my rock today in terms of an impartial proponent of the law, and I'm very much looking forward to what she has to share with respect to our project as well. Otherwise, I kind of want to get started. So I've organized the questions into 3 categories: governance, water, and transportation. These are the 3 things that I found were the most emphasized points of concern. So to begin, there's been some confusion and some inability to disentangle the roles of the NWMO and CNSC. I would like to give Joe the opportunity to talk about the role of the NWMO with respect to the project and how the CNSC, and then give Nancy a chance to reply about how the CNC is like distinctly different from the NWMO in this respect. Go ahead, Joe.
Good, so welcome everyone. My name is Joe Heil. I'm the Director for Indigenous Relations for Northwest Ontario for the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. NWMO is actually looking for a permanent home for Canada's used nuclear fuel. So that's our main goal. We're actually formed under the Used Fuel Waste Act, and that act states a number of things. It describes how we're funded, describes that we're formed as a non-for-profit. It also describes that we have an advisory committee that actually oversees our work. And at the end of the day, we end up reporting on a triennial report up to the Minister of Natural Resources through NRCan. We are the proponent. We are the ones actually looking to make this happen. And the process in which we're following is something called APM, Adaptive Phase Management. It was a process that was put forward to the Government of Canada in 2007. And APM, it's not very descriptive, but let me describe it. It's a two-pronged process. It really looks at the technical work and also looks at the social. On the technical side, we're looking at a number of things. We're looking principally at a deep geological repository to host Canada's used nuclear fuel. We also look at the current science, and as Peter will describe, hopefully, we do look at reprocessing, and we do, try to bring the best science to it. And so on an annual basis, we do look at reprocessing as a potential solution at some point. We're not actually going there at this point in time, but who knows, things may change. We're also making sure that the fuel is retrievable at the end of the day. And the second part of our process is really driven by this concept of social acceptability, which we have defined as an informed, willing host. So after our process was accepted by Canada in 2010, we began the process of actually looking for an informed, willing host. So in 2010, we put out a siting document. And that's what we're in right now, is we're in a siting process. We're looking for a community that's willing to go forward on this journey with us to actually go through an approvals process. So in 2010, we asked communities who would be interested in doing this. By 2013, 22 communities had put their hand up, and then we stopped asking. We actually thought we only get a couple, but we ended up with 22, which is quite a lot. And each community, we've been looking at those two sort of pillars, the technical and the social. And that's what we've been doing for the last almost 10 years now, and narrowing the communities down. And it was, I think, 2 years ago, we got down to 2 communities, South Bruce and Ignis. Now, I said South Bruce and Ignis for a reason, because First Nation communities were not part of that conversation. So we sort of realized that, that was sort of a bit of a flaw in our process. So certainly First Nation communities are part of it. So up here in Northern Ontario, certainly Ignis put their hand up. They actually put their hand up in 2010 and been working with them ever since on and getting to we are today. But we also recognize that Wabigoon was the closest community to the site, is literally in their backyard. So in 2015, we're working with Wabigoon and actually, enter into agreement with them to go to sort of learn about the process. And that's where Wabigoon is right now, is they're learning about this process, and we're engaged with them. And both Wabigoon and Ignis have to agree before this project goes forward in the Northwest. Similarly, in the South, we have Saugeen Ojibwe Nation and South Bruce. Again, both have to agree before we move forward in the process down there. And if they all say yes, that would be fantastic, and then we'll use other criteria to determine whether we go north or south. We're hoping to make that decision in 2024, and then move into the next phase of the process, which is really the regulatory decision-making phase of the process. And you heard about some of that this morning in some of the presentations. And that's really where the town of Dryden and other surrounding communities, and in particular First Nations communities, really have a very strong voice on this project. So I think you'll stop there and then go ahead.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Nancy, I think a good place to start is just talking about your role at the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and then building into what the role of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is with respect to our project proposed by the NWMO.
So again, my name is Nancy Greencorn, and I'm the Director of the Waste and Decommissioning Division at the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, or the CNSC, which at the CNSC, we independently regulate the nuclear industry. We do this to protect the health, the safety and security of the environment, to implement Canada's international obligations for the peaceful use of energy, and to disseminate scientific and technical information to the public. So the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is composed of the Commission, which are comprised of members of who are appointed by the Governor and Council, and they are the independent decision makers, as well as the CNSC staff. I am one of the CNSC staff. The staff includes scientists, engineers, etc., who perform the technical assessments of documents, as well as endeavor to disseminate the scientific information. We are also independent, similar to the Commission, from industry. We are not employed by industry, and we must abide by the Code of Ethics and Values for public servants. Our Commission makes decisions through a transparent, evidence-based framework based on recommendations from the staff. So again, the staff perform the technical assessments, and the Commission also takes input from the public, Indigenous groups, and any that may be wanting to share the information. And they do so in a public process, and so we have a public hearing process at the CNSC, and the decisions then rendered by the Commission are science-based and risk-informed. I was asked to speak more so to this project. As we heard this morning from the Impact Assessment Agency, there will be an impact assessment that is done, and it will be one project for this, and so there will be an opportunity for engagement with various members of the public and communities throughout that process. But I guess I want to reiterate, we are independent from industry, and we do make regulatory decisions based on science. I think the last final point I would raise on that is when members of the public or Indigenous nations and communities want to participate in our public proceedings, we offer participant funding. And so there is an opportunity for funding to be received for those processes. Speaking one last thing to our independence is we frequently undergo peer reviews, and we had an international peer review mission in 2019 by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is or IAEA, who have found that the CNSC is independent and measured against international standards.
Thank you so much. I also wanted to bring Carrie into this conversation to sort of distinguish the roles of the parties involved. Carrie, if you don't mind explaining a little bit about your role and the role of like the policies that sort of govern the project, including the Assessment Act, if you don't mind.
Great, thanks, Ethan. I'm Carrie Blaze, and I'm a staff lawyer at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and it's great to join you all this evening, albeit virtually. I am joining you from the Robinson Huron Treaty Territory and the traditional territory of the Nipissing and Doquis First Nations. And so we've heard a bit from NWMO and the CNSC about their roles, and I just wanted to kind of step in to say, when we look at this process, there are a number of players, and there are a number of roles, and there are laws, that's established. Let's say, the NWMO, and they were set up by statute in 2002. But their directors are actually the utility companies. So the nuclear fuel waste owners are the directors of the NWMO. And so they are tasked with coming up with a plan that NWMO is now proposing. My organization, the Canadian Environmental Law Association, we are a nonprofit. We're a team of lawyers who represent public interest, low-income litigants. And we've publicly stated to government that the nuclear waste should not be overseen by the owners of that fuel waste, but rather an independent agency. But we're going to talk about the current structure, so I'm just going to park that there. Also mentioned by Nancy was the Impact Assessment Agency, and they came about after some reforms in 2019 to our federal environmental assessment laws. And I think it's critical to note that while there will be an impact assessment for this proposal, should it move ahead, the impact assessment, which is a multi-stage proceeding and has lots of opportunities for public comment, that actually happens after an agreement is signed with a willing host. So the impact assessment is very much in the future, and it does not come before a determination on willing host is made. And just to give you a snapshot of what you would expect in an impact assessment, the agency would be considering questions of the purpose and the need for the project, alternatives to the project, and impacts to sustainability, and also broader effects to social, cultural, environmental, and Indigenous rights and values. And of course, the CNSC is a significant player in this as well as the regulator. And if there is a willing host, their responsibility would be to issue a license for the potential DGR. And when they would opine on whether it meets thresholds for protecting the environment and human health. This might sound redundant, it might sound like an impact assessment, but it's actually a much narrower licensing procedure. So this happens after the impact assessment has occurred, and the CNSC, as a regulatory body, will consider a much narrower set of questions. So the larger questions, around who is the host, where will it be sited, those ones have already been made. I'll stop there, Ethan.
Thank you so much. So now that we kind of have an idea of the players at the table, I want to get a little bit more into the details that were brought up, like specific concerns with respect to the project and some of the timelines that are proposed. Even for me, Joe, I'm hoping maybe you can actually clarify what the 300-year timeline for institutional control actually means with respect to the Deep Geological Repository. And then I'm going to move over to you, Dr. Ottensmeyer, to kind of make apparent what the actual half-lives and hazardous timelines of the materials that are going to be stored in the Deep Geological Repository are, and what alternatives there might be to that storage. So, Joe, if you don't mind walking us through what the institutional control aspect of that timeline is.
Talk sort of a general sort of timeline, how we sort of see things playing out at this point in time. To give you some timelines and give you some sense of the length of time that we're thinking at this point in time. So right now, we're in the site decision process right now, and hopefully, again, by 2024, we will have a site, north or south. We don't know yet at this point in time. Thereafter, we'll enter into the regulatory decision-making process, seek a number of license to prepare the site, license to construct. We're hoping to have that by the sort of early 2030s, let's say 2033. And then construction would begin. and then shortly after that, filing for an operations license. And hopefully, the construction will be done around 2043, 2043, 2045, around that period of time. So, I mean, that's 20 years from now before we even begin operations. At that point in time, hopefully transportation will begin. Given the amount of fuel anticipated, it'll take somewhere between 40 to 60 years to move all that fuel to the site. At that point in time, that's when operations ends. So that takes us up to 2080, 2090, 2100, right? At that point in time, then that's when we really are in our what we call the monitoring phase. The tunnels at that point in time, all the tunnels are full of fuel. They're all backfilled with bentonite. The shaft is still open, and we're in some type of monitoring period at that point in time. The plan currently is to monitor for about 70 years. And then, there will be at some point in time, a decision by the future generation, by 2170, a decision made by the communities that we've monitored enough, and then we're looking to potentially decommission, close it up, and really sort of, leave it at that point in time. We'll have hopefully faith that the process is working and go from there. So, I mean, it's pretty far down the line. These are decisions going to be made by future generations. And, it's hard to predict what they'll actually look like. But that's sort of what I understand where we are when we're looking that far ahead in 300 years. And maybe I'll turn it to Paul if he can add more to that. Now.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Paul Grishevsky. I'm with the NWMO. I'm the Director of Safety and Technical Research, and I'm calling in today from the municipality of Clarington, which is on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas and the Anishinaabe, known today as the Williams Treaty First Nations. So the question in terms of the timing, I think Joe summarized it well. There's a time frame that we envisage. There's a period of monitoring that will go as long as it needs to, and at that point, those future generations, when they're comfortable, will choose to close. At that point, the repository would rely on the engineered barriers and the natural barriers. We'll talk about that more in some other questions to basically hold the fuel, allow it to decay back to radioactivity levels similar to that of uranium ore body from which the fuel came from in this original case. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for the follow-up, Paul. With respect to the actual timeline of the hazardous timeline and lifetime of the spent nuclear fuel, I'm hoping that you can clarify some of the numbers for us, Dr. Ottensmeyer, and sort of the period of time that we're looking at there being some level of risk associated with the DGR.
Part of that I indicated to you in my talk this afternoon for the audience that was here. And so I'll just reiterate some of the things. If you leave the used fuel the way it is, then the longest lifetime of the fuel is the transuranics, the atoms heavier than uranium that are created in the reactor. And they will not return to the levels of natural uranium for about 400,000 years. And there's no way around that unless you use physics and split them. And then they no longer exist and they become something else. The fission product component initially starts out being much more radioactive, but it decays very quickly. And so that, as I indicated in my talk, the current longest Pickering fuel, the fission product radioactivity is already lower than the radioactivity from the transuranics. The fission product radioactivity will attain levels of uranium, natural uranium, after about 264 years. But most of the isotopes in the fission products have decayed before that, long before that. It's basically only cesium-137 and strontium-90 that are the major components. And then at a level that's below natural uranium, there are some there's a handful of long-lived fission products, like, for instance, iodine-129, which has a half-life of 17 million years. It's long, but it also means that its radioactivity is very low because they sort of go reciprocally hand in hand. But if you separate the components, as I indicated, and as a possibility of recycling the material, then you can also eliminate the radioactivity of the iodine-129 because it becomes volatile in the process of processing, and you can capture it, irradiate it, change it into iodine-130, which in about 12 days becomes xenon-130, which is stable, so that you change the 17 million lifetime into something that's stable about 12 days after it comes back out of a reactor. So it depends on whether you use your knowledge of physics or whether you say, well, I've got this used fuel and I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm just going to throw it away, just like I indicated this afternoon. You know my preference, which is to separate, because then even the lifetime of the fission products, the natural lifetime, is what I would say is approximates the 7 generation times that is often talked about by our indigenous communities. It's less than 300 years, and depending on what you consider to be your generation time, it's of that order. So I think I wouldn't put it away. I would do something with it, apply physics, apply knowledge, and get a lot more energy out of it.
Thank you, Dr. Ottensmeyer. And I want to follow up just a little bit before I pass this over to the rest of the panel for follow-up. But my understanding is that it wouldn't be the responsibility of the NWMO to pursue reactors capable of reprocessing. And if they were to build a deep geological repository, that there is the possibility that we might be able to recover the fuel for the purposes of reprocessing and recycling. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that from my own curiosity.
Basically, the NWMO is a federal organization, and according to the constitutional separation of powers, producing energy is a provincial right, and therefore the NWMO cannot, as a federal entity, go and work with reactors. But it can do the recycling because that doesn't create energy. Sorry, there was something else that you...
And then, sorry, I appreciate you answering my question then, and I'm curious if there is the possibility of recovery from storage in a deep geological repository if recycling technology were to become popular.
Well, I understand from Joe Heil here that the possibility exists, and I would like him to explain that further, because I would say the only thing that I've seen is that it's recoverable as long as the passages are open, whereas the prospect seems to be that the individual galleries are going to be plugged with about 10 meters worth of concrete, even though the shaft is still open, obviously, at that time. And so that makes it difficult to retrieve. And so I would like Joe to explain that a little further, because that's a moving situation. Because I asked Frank King, who was with the NWMO many years ago, about retrievability, and his answer, well, this was at the joint panel review, about retrievability, and the panel asked him, and he said, well, if we wanted to retrieve it, why would we put it down there in the first place? So this, I think I'd like some clarification on that.
Okay. I wasn't expecting to answer this question. I don't think we have a definite statement on this, but let me take a stab at it. So yes, it is retrievable. It's not reversible, right? So it doesn't make it more difficult for that. The good news about this waste is we know where it is. And I think that's really the piece that really is what you're speaking about, what allows it to be used potentially in the future. It's a lot of fuel. One of the largest mines in Canada, uranium mines, is Cigar Lake. The amount of fuel in which we're putting into the ground here is equivalent to that, and we know where it is, and we know exactly where it is. So yes, it may be difficult getting through the concrete and the hardened bentonite clay, but certainly we know where it is. So it's something that can be done. There would be additional costs for sure.
Thank you, Joe, for following up on that, and I'm sorry for dropping that on you, but it's something that I think is important to keep in mind when we're talking about the project, especially with respect to the technologies that Dr. Altensmeyer's talking about. Bernine, I've seen you raising your hand, and I want to give you the opportunity to speak towards the timeline. So go ahead, but please keep it brief because I have to move on.
Well, we are in panel comments on this
Yes,
question.
yes, we are in panel comments on this question.
Thank you. I'm Bernine Lloyd from Northwatch. I reside in Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory and traveled through Anishinaabe Nation territory to arrive here in Anishinaabe territory, and I thank you for the welcome. So there's a number of issues I think we need to flag here. One is that while Dr. Altensmeyer talks about his vision of recycling or reprocessing, I would describe it as a niche approach, and we need to understand that reprocessing more generally and internationally is it's a problematic process. In general, it's a highly contaminating process, and it doesn't resolve or relieve us of the problem of the long-term isolation or management of high-level radioactive waste. It just changes the problem. Generally, most experience to date is with the Purex system. You dissolve the fuel in acid, and it changes the problem. It does not relieve it, because then you've got a liquid waste. Countries with experience like France then often vitrify it to turn it back into a solid form, but it's a highly contaminating process, and it is a process loaded with proliferation risk because you have separated out the plutonium, which is a weapons material. So it would not be a welcome addition to a project in this area. I'm really concerned by the way that Joe has described the NWMO approach, saying that, they, on an annual basis, they look at reprocessing as a potential solution. NWMO has a watching brief on reprocessing, partitioning, and I think they include transmutation in that. But the flavor of it is not presenting it as a potential solution. The flavor of it, as I have always taken it, is that it is part of watching what's happening internationally. There are different approaches, there are different activities. So I think the comments we're hearing tonight, the way Joe is characterizing it, saying making sure the fuel is retrievable at the end of the day. Well, I don't think the NWMO has a commitment to retrievability. The description is more, well, it's retrievable until it's not. Canada and the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act doesn't have a requirement of retrievability. France does, Canada doesn't. So, we've moved into a number of different areas that really require a lot of examination, more than the kind of quick pass we're getting here. And there are a number of residents in the region who have flagged a concern about the option at the Deep Geological Repository site of shallow caverns, interim storage, sometimes it's described as shallow caverns. couple that option of shallow caverns with the potential for reprocessing, a favorable attitude on the part of the NWMO to reprocessing, and that option of shallow caverns becomes an even bigger red flag than it has been to date. Thank you.
I appreciate your vigor, Bernane, but I would really appreciate if we didn't attack people so much as their ideas. And with respect to the technologies that I decided to inquire about with Dr. Ottensmeyer, it's very important to remember that the NWMO isn't the one responsible for pursuing those technologies. I simply wanted to discuss with Dr. Ottensmeyer whether or not a DGR would doom our ability to pursue the technology of waste recycling as a country and not as a corporation.
Ethan, I'm
Now-
unclear who you think I attacked.
No, I would like to just quickly return the conversation over to Dr. Ottensmeyer and to Joe.
I would like to agree with Brennan about the Purex process. It's messy. It leaves waste. It's a military process, or developed by the military, as she says, to purify plutonium. What I was proposing this afternoon was the other process, which was developed by a Canadian in the States, pyroprocessing or electro refining. And that basically takes the metal as an anode, passes it through an electrolyte, and comes out as a pure metal on the cathode. The electrolyte catches the fission products. Those are periodically separated in a chromatographic column, and the fluids are put back into as an electrolyte to continue on, so that basically you don't have this massive waste, this liquid waste there at all. It's a solid to solid on the electrode, and it's a solid when the fission products are extracted. The working fluids are recycled. So I think, if you'd like, I give you more information on that, but Purex, I entirely agree with you, but there are better techniques.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I just want to, I think Renee's right. I might have overstated what we do with respect to, we issue a report every year on reprocessing, and just sort of what's the general science on that. So thanks for correcting that, because that does need to be corrected in that sense. With respect to shallow caverns, we said before at one of these settings, I think a few months ago, we're not doing shallow barrel, will not be part of the project description on a go-forward basis. So I can state that again. Yes.
I appreciate the honesty. Moving on to my third question with respect to governance, I wanted to define what the Revel batholith is and what makes the geology of this area so special, especially in the context of comparing it to the geology of the area close to the generating stations in southern Ontario. I was hoping you could explore that for us, Joe.
I can start this, and then again, I'll ask Paul to fill in the gaps, particularly on the characterization of the rock. When we talk, I don't know how many people know what a batholith is, but it's a large rock. This rock that and there's these large batholiths within Northern Ontario. Typically, the basement rock is what we call greenstone. It's the basalt. And up here, the rock up here is formed about 2.7 billion years ago. And there was a subductive zone that was happening, and then the rock separated, and the lighter rock rose to the surface, these big pieces of granite. And they formed about 2.6 billion years ago, and they've been there ever since. And that's what you have here in the Canadian Shield. You have this sort of basalt greenstone rock, and then you have these big giant granite rock, almost big like giant boulders. And the rock that we're looking at, it's called the Revel batholith, because I guess near the Revel River. But this is a very large rock. It is about 15 kilometers wide, 40 kilometers long, and 2 or 3 kilometers thick. And it's pretty homogeneous. It's one sort of large rock, and that's what we're exploring. And what's unique about these rocks is mostly all granite. It's very all the same. And the reasons we like these rocks, not because it's only strong, but people usually don't mine on it. They may take some stuff off the surface for countertops and those type of things, but typically, you know, it's one of those areas when people don't go deep underground and what have you. That's one of our criteria. Maybe I'll turn it over to Paul. He does the safety assessment. He did the confidence safety, and he can describe why we like this rock and some of the properties that this rock is telling us at this point in time. So, Paul, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Joe. I think you've already given a good kind of a picture there of what the Revell batholith is. Just in general, we're fortunate in Canada. We have two very old rock types. We have the Canadian Shield and the Revell batholith is part of that. It's a 3 billion year old, 2.7 billion year old piece of rock. In southern Ontario, it's a different type of rock. It's called a sedimentary rock. They are layers left over from ancient seas. So they're about 400 million years old. But between those two, they are the oldest rock formations broadly in North America. So the kind of features that both of these rocks have is that they're old, stable rocks. They're both strong rocks. They've been around, reflected in their age. The nature of the rock at the two sites is that the rock is homogeneous, which makes it easier to characterize and understand its behavior. The things that we need to know, and we are learning now through the borehole programs, is what do we see at the depth of the rock? Is there water in the porosity of the rock? Are there fractures? Where are they? And to make sure that the sites that we're looking at within the rocks, these particular sites, are not connected to the surface. We're looking for certain chemistry signatures that are favorable for the repository. In general, when you go down deep, there's no oxygen, which is favorable for the repository. But there's some other chemistry things that we're looking at. So there's a variety of things we're looking at. And I guess the other two things I'll quickly mention, we want a seismically stable location. So both of these areas we're looking at are seismically stable. And we don't want areas that have mineral potential. And again, the nature of both of these sites is that there aren't any minerals in the area around the repository. So these are the variety of the features that we're looking for, and we're in an early stage of our site characterization, but the information that we see so far supports the fact that these two sites have these favorable attributes.
Thank you, Paul. Nancy, I was hoping you could clarify how the CNSC approaches safety with respect to geology, especially in the circumstances of our local area here.
So I'll start by saying that when we have a regulatory framework in place at the CNSC, what that Julia spoke about it this morning, and it essentially has a Nuclear Safety and Control Act, and then there's regulations, and below that there are regulatory documents. And in these regulatory documents, we stipulate CNSC's expectations for if we were to receive a license application, the type of information we require of the applicant. So looking at, for a deep geological repository, we would want to see the geoscientific information. That could be the site characterization information, the geology, and CNSC staff would do an independent review of this. CNSC staff, I talked about them before, they're scientists, engineers, geologists, but they also do their own independent research. So for decades at the CNSC, we have been doing research and looking at what other international countries are doing with respect to this. So CNSC staff do a very thorough technical review of the application before then making a recommendation to the Commission. And again, it's the Commission that is the decision maker with respect to licensing processes.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to give Carrie an opportunity to weigh in on the siting and the location with respect to the legal rights of Dryden and the legal rights of Ignace and Treaty 3 and what that legal framework looks like.
Thanks, Ethan. Yeah, if I can turn the conversation to the human element in the community itself. So, around siting, and As we heard, there was 22 communities initially that were part of the site selection process, and that began in 2010, and now 2 remain. And so with the NWMO being tasked to make a determination on willingness, we have to ask who is included in that willingness determination of a willing host and who is left out, and how does that play into future steps in the process, and will environmental rights be protected? So I'll try and give kind of a highlight of all of that. So it's a basic environmental right and a core principle of environmental justice that when there's a decision that might have the potential to impact your health, the social, or your environmental surroundings, those who stand to be affected have a right to participate in those decisions. And I think we can all attest to the fact that you can't participate in a decision if you don't have equal access to the information, to the documents, to peer review that might be informing the decision to be made. And so for those who may be affected, who should be part of this willingness determination, we have to then take a step back and say, well, who could be affected by this proposal and thus has the right to participate? We have to question, are the people being consulted the ones who will be most impacted? Are we thinking about Indigenous rights and treaty rights? What about the affected communities that are along the transportation route, and how do they factor into the willingness determination? And so right now, a municipality, could be considered in the process as one body. Let's say that could be defined as affected. And we would advocate at the Canadian Environmental Law Association that who is included within this group of affected individuals and communities should be broad, because our understanding of its potential impacts is continuing to grow as well as alongside the number of uncertainties accompanying this project. And so given the time span we're considering, and the NWO has found that the fuel will be needed to be managed for hundreds of thousands of years, and only after 1 million will it approach the radioactive levels of background. Given these timelines, which has to be front and center, we have to always also ask, how do we consider those who can't speak for themselves, such as children and future generations? And so when we're looking at this willingness determination and who may be affected in this siting process, we have to also account for change and uncertainties. So when this process began in the early 2000s, when the Nuclear Waste Management Organization was looking to find a host community, and it had that list of 22 communities, when it was discussed, it was for a finite amount of waste, and it was from the CANDU reactors at Pickering and Darlington and Bruce. And only now are we having conversations that it might incorporate new waste streams from non-CANDU fuel. And so these fuels their characteristics are different, their toxicity is different, and so how do we account for these changes if we're making a willingness determination? And so your information keeps changing regarding what it is the affected community, the affected individual is having to actually make a decision on. And that's why ultimately ensuring that those who are affected have a say in the decision with equal rights to information and capacity to participate, it is fundamental to preventing an environmental injustice and critical to any decision on willingness.
That's awesome. Nancy, just a quick point, please. We got to move on.
Am I on?
Yeah.
Okay. I'd just like to follow up on what I had added earlier. So while the CNSC may not have regulatory oversight on the site selection process, if there is a potential impact assessment, as that if we receive an application, any and all potentially impacted communities will have the opportunity to provide comments, and that would inform the integrated review panel's advice to the minister. So while site selection may not be oversaw as part of the regulatory framework of the CNSC, there will be opportunities that as part of the initial description through the project, if it was to proceed, right till closure.
And that both Carrie's points and your points, Nancy, segue really well into what I want to talk about next, which is water. When I'm looking through sort of the magazine put together by Tyler, it's not hard to notice how important the lake is to the community and the culture here, and how important this what is the biggest watershed in Canada is to the way of life of people that live here. And I wanted to talk to you, Bernane, about, I got a lot of questions about the demonstration at Turtle River with respect to the nuke pucks, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to sort of address that and talk about what the purposes of that demonstration were. And then that'll flow nicely into Carrie with a follow-up about avenues for people to pursue the addressing of these concerns with respect to the DGR.
Thanks, Ethan. And I'm not going to assume that everyone knows what Ethan is actually referring to by the nuke pucks. If everybody is familiar with that, that means it was a very effective action, because it actually, people know about it and noticed it and made the connection. So in the late spring, there was a release of some cedar rounds, Ethan's calling them, and they were called the nuke pucks. So cedar rounds painted with the atomic symbol in biodegradable, non-toxic paint, and they were released into the Turtle River and the Wabigoon River, into those two watersheds. And they were released to illustrate or draw attention to the water, to the watersheds and the connection of the different water systems and the flow of water. So that was the intent. The intent was to make the connection between this project, the Deep Geological Repository Project, and the potential for risk to the watersheds, the Turtle River and Wabigoon watersheds. That was the intent, and it was to illustrate the connectivity there. There were limitations, of course. It was a modest volunteer effort, and really relies on people then finding that cedar round marked with an atomic symbol, recognizing it as being part of that project, going to the We the Nuclear Free North website and emailing and saying, oh, I found this cedar round marked with an atomic symbol. So some limitations to the project. I guess had they been, fitted with electronic tracking devices, there would have been an environmental consequence, which, while I wasn't really involved in the design and delivery, I might have become involved in the design and delivery or the design debate anyway, if that was ever proposed to be an added feature. But it was environmentally quite benign project. Another limitation is that while the used fuel packaging plant, the releases or any contaminants from that are more likely to be very directly to the surface water in the area. For the Deep Geological Repository, releases at depth will report out to locations that it's very difficult to predict. So I'm optimistic that that effort, that small project, maybe helped people connect the issues, but certainly it's a fairly modest effort. Whether this worked or not to communicate to the public, it's hard to tell. These things, they sometimes work, they sometimes don't. We got very, very mixed feedback on it. I would say overall it worked for some people and it didn't for others, and that's often the case. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization did an egg drop with grades 7 and 8 students at the school in Ignace to try to make the link between packaging and transportation safety. It didn't work for me. I didn't think having grade 7 and 8 students drop eggs in different packaging made that connection, but it might have worked for some people. So that's the effort, is to communicate, and the effectiveness of that effort, I think that we would have to do a pretty serious survey of the public to evaluate it in either of those cases.
Thank you, Bernane. And I'll come back to you before this conversation is over. But I want to pass the torch over to Carrie to talk about avenues for people to explore similar concerns to those involved with the Turtle River demonstration, perhaps potentially risky avenues. And then I want to follow up with Kimberly to talk about sort of the science behind water dating and the importance of water to the community of Dryden with respect to the DGR project. So first, Carrie, please take it away.
Thanks, Ethan. I'd like to start by saying I actually encourage community members to get to know their waterways and their watersheds. And so perhaps you're a fisherman or you like to go fishing, perhaps you're a kayaker like myself. I strongly encourage anyone to get to know their waterways and the movement of that water. And I think there's a number of questions. As a legal aid clinic, we get phone calls, emails from individuals asking about, well, how will the downstream communities be affected from this project or from any mining project or any new development, let's say that's happening. So it's very common to get this question of, well, what are my water rights, or what is the right of water, and what can be done to protect it? So I thank everyone who is an advocate and water protector. I think it's critical. And so there was a recent report that was commissioned by CELA and the Toxics Free Great Lakes Binational Network. And it actually found that radionuclides pose a current and sustained threat to the Great Lakes environment and its inhabitants. And if you imagine, I don't have visuals, but if you imagine, a map of Ontario, we have the nuclear power plants along Lake Ontario. We have a uranium refinery and decommissioned uranium mine sites along Lake Huron, and getting closer to Superior as well. And so when there's an opportunity for community members to say, well, what about the water? There's two suggestions I have. And one, it's already been touched on briefly, so I won't go into it in detail, but it is critical in my mind that the impact assessment process, it's a process that allows you to look before you leap. So before there's any decision on what development may occur, you have an impact assessment. And an impact assessment can absolutely get to questions of hydrology and watershed features and the basin and the movement of water and the cumulative effects over time. So that would be my first critical step in the puzzle that is out of place, is that this impact assessment doesn't happen until a community has actually agreed to be willing. The second suggestion I have, and this wouldn't be for just water, but any concern about effects to the environment, social, cultural, or otherwise, and that is the opportunity to actually request a regional assessment. So a regional assessment can be requested through the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and it would allow us to actually evaluate effects to the existing or future activities of the area over a broader geographic area. So there isn't one currently proposed for this area, but it's one that any citizen can request. So they are governed by the Federal Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and they move beyond a project-specific kind of lens, and they look at a regional, hence the name, a regional context to actually inform that later on specific project assessment. And so again, this is something that can be done in writing by any member of the public. I would suggest you seek some independent legal advice, but it is a tool that is available. It's an environmental right. We do have the Impact Assessment Agency, and that is a tool available. And again, it's one that's not currently set out in the NWMO's step-by-step process, but it's one that exists regardless of the development going on. I'll leave it there, Ethan. Thanks.
Thank you. And I wanted to give Kimberly the opportunity to follow up on some of the science behind the design of the DGR with respect to water protection, in addition to addressing some of the concerns raised about the Turtle River demonstration. She also might not be able to hear me letting her know. Kimberly, can you start again for us?
boil water orders. In many of these communities, it's been an extended period of time since water could be used freely for bathing, drinking, cooking, or brushing teeth. In other parts of the world, we're starting to see some of the impacts of climate change and industrial activities. This comes in the form of water shortages, droughts, and other environmental changes. That's not to say all of the changes that we see are barriers. They are challenges that we will need to overcome together if our planet is to be sustainable in the long term. For anyone who has been through a boil water order that's lasted a couple of days, I'd like you to consider how much of a pain that was. You're filling bathtubs, you're filling every cooking pot in the house. You are dying of thirst, but you have to wait at least 5 to 10 minutes for a pot of water to boil. If that were our everyday, the reaches would go far beyond our households, because much of our food supply also depends on having clean water to drink. With respect to a deep geological repository, one thing that was mentioned was the structure of the rock that is being considered for this project. Its characteristics are such that it has an isolation type property. So the water sources that would become contaminated in the case of a surface spill, those are quite different in terms of how they behave and in terms of their biological characteristics than from the water that you would find potentially at the lowest depth of a deep geological repository. One of the key parameters, in fact, that many countries do consider when they're thinking about building a deep geological repository is how that water in the vicinity of the repository communicates with surface water sources. The deciding factor being there can be no communication. And this is ensured using several different methods. One, you can test the deep water to determine what kind of microorganisms live in the water and compare those to microorganisms found in surface water. In some cases, you can also use an analysis where you look at the nuclear isotopes underground. One of the things that some people may not know is in decades gone by, when nuclear weapons testing happened, when the Chernobyl nuclear power plant had its nuclear accident, all of these things released radionuclides into our atmosphere, and those radionuclides settled on the surface. In surface water, you can still measure the presence of some of these entities, whereas water at depth that has never communicated with the surface, you won't actually find these radionuclides. So when folks are wondering, and when you have questions, whether it's for the CNSC or the NWMO or other organizations, you could ask them to walk you through how they did their water investigation and how they're assured that the underground activities will not interact with water on the surface. In particular, with First Nation communities, and there are First Nation communities in the vicinity of Dryden who have experience with the long-term effects of poor water and not having clean water available. It's for any interaction, whether that interaction is meant to be highlighting a surface water issue or otherwise, it's very important to consult with First Nations whose traditional territory you're operating in. For example, the medicine cedar is very sacred to me. It's one of the most sacred medicines. And I completely understand a number of the questions that Ethan had received, for example, about the particular form chosen for this demonstration. So I think that regarding how people choose to interact with the water or how people choose to interact with the proponent on this project, it's really important to consult with First Nations, particularly when any activities are being carried out in their territory, because this is their ancestral land. Many Northern First Nations, you still see a lot of elders and community members who depend on the land for their food. And so without that land and without that water, they simply wouldn't survive. They would be forced to relocate to another area where, they have access to the basic necessities. And I'll leave it there, Ethan.
Thank you, Kimberly. I want to continue the conversation about water. I do think that from all of the questions I received, water was one of the biggest points of emphasis. And so I want to give Nancy the opportunity to sort of explore the safety requirements that must be met to be licensed, focusing on water and leakage.
So I've spoke a few times about our regulatory framework. And within that, we have expectations of our licensees under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act that licensees implement and maintain environmental monitoring programs. And these are to demonstrate that the public and the environment are protected from any activities related to the project. So as part of a license application, a proponent would need to provide us with that environmental monitoring program. This really starts before a license application is done. It's done prior to preparing site. Baseline data is needed to establish that baseline. And then monitoring is required to be ongoing throughout the life cycle if a facility was granted a license. And the monitoring is looking at, is the facility performing as expected? Are the assumptions that were made early on consistent with that? So as a CNSC, we have these programs that are provided. And I'm saying environmental protection programs, but really there's numerous programs that licensees have to submit to the CNSC, and they can be radiation protection or operating performance. And so we look at these requirements as a whole. And these don't just stop if a license is granted for a license to prepare a site. They go on, and there's needed to have what will be the post-closure plans as well. So if this was granted and there was closure, what monitoring will be done post-closure? And so if there was active institutional controls, what would be some of the indicators if they're of the performance? The other thing I'd like to add, in addition to the proponent or the license applicant being required to have these programs, the CNSC as well does its own independent environmental monitoring. As we have a program called the IEMP, in which CNSC staff go out and take samples around licensed facilities to compare our results with that of the licensee and to confirm that is safe. So I guess in conclusion is there is quite a regulatory framework, and we have regulatory documents that stipulate what is required of the proponent for environmental monitoring, and then CNSC staff review those programs to ensure they meet our regulatory expectations. And this is just not a one thing. They're iteratively updated, and more information is added to them on an ongoing basis. And then we independently go out and do some monitoring as well.
I really appreciate that. And I think, Joe, if you and Paul don't mind, before I pass it back to Bernane for closing about water, walking through how the NWMO will determine whether or not there will be like surface communication with like water within the repository, what the risks are, and how you guys plan on mitigating those risks.
Can you just repeat that?
Yes, of course, no problem. So how does the NWMO plan on surveying the site with respect to water safety? And you touched on it briefly this morning with the core sampling. And I wanted to give you another opportunity to bring that forward in addition to Paul before I pass to Bernane for closing.
Yeah, I'll start, and then again, I'll ask Paul to fill in the gaps I miss. So when we're looking, first of all, I just wanted to say, with respect to the puck thing, right? I appreciate it because it highlights this issue. We need to talk about it. So I think that's good. And at the end of the day, we're trying to do the same thing. We want to protect the land and the water. That's our goal. We actually have the same goal. And, we just take it from different approaches at the end of the day, I think. When it comes to the area of water safety, I think we have to think it in three different parts, or we do think it in three different parts: transportation, operation, and post-closure. So with respect to transportation, certainly, part of our reliance is the container design itself, the Class B container. And it has to be tested with respect to submersion to water at different depths and what have you. So certainly that's one part of the thing that we're looking at. And part of that, what are the routes that look like? What are the water bodies in which it could be exposed to, those type of things. The next is operational safety. Certainly, Renee mentioned about emissions from the repackaging of the fuel into the used fuel storage containers. Certainly, that'll be done on hot cells, but there may be who knows what happens to things. So we're looking at all that. The other piece of very significance at the site will be the rock pile. This is in some ways a mining operation. There will be a rock pile, and we're examining the rock. Right now, we have good indication it's non-acid generating, which is good, but certainly that's another source of contamination which we're looking at. And then lastly, post-closure. So when we get into that long-term closure of the facility and, the container stored deep underground, and that's what I talked about this morning, is really about the fracture network. That's where we spend a lot of time looking at the rock. This rock does have fractures in it, and really what we understand as you get further down, the fractures start to close up. They start to become disconnected from the surface. So we're looking for that spot in the rock where we can provide some assurances that where we are within the repository is essentially, for all intents and purposes, disconnected from the surface, and there would be no pathway to the surface through the fractures at the end of the day. And we do that through borehole drilling. We do that through different 2D and 3D seismic analysis. We do that through shallow water monitoring. So there's a number of methods in which we employ to make that happen. So maybe I'll turn it over to Paul to follow up and fill in the gaps for me. Thanks.
Can we just make sure that Paul does an audio test before he starts? I don't want anyone to miss anything. Okay.
Can you hear me now? Is that clear? See heads nodding, so I'll proceed. So I think Joe gave a good overview of the things that we're looking at. Many of these things that we're looking at in the rock are ultimately related to water. So we're looking for properties of the rock in a variety of different ways. And we get those through, for example, just to repeat them, the core samples that we take from the boreholes. We can analyze the core samples for chemistry, for isotopes, for signatures that tell us about the age of the rock and the age of the water in the rock. We're looking through the boreholes and also through seismic studies where you put sound, you thump the rock essentially at surface and you listen with very careful microphones, and that tells you something about the structure of the rock. So while boreholes are very specific along a particular line, the acoustic, the seismic surveys, they give you information about larger volumes of rock. We'll put in instruments in those boreholes that will monitor for years, that will tell us about the pressures in the rock and the stresses in the rock. So that's the third part of this, which is understanding the geology, knowing the story of the rock and how it was formed and the history of the rock. So that also tells us about how it would likely behave, or the water would behave around the rock. And maybe the fourth, two more points. One is in addition to the rock itself, just to be clear, there are a number of engineered barriers that we also use to help ensure the overall system provides the safety to the environment, including the water. And in the case of the DGR design, it's the properties of the fuel bundles, the container, and the clay around that. They're all put there in addition to the geosphere to give that overall safety story. And then the last point I'll mention is that some of these things are things that we do early on as we explore the site and support the site selection, and then go into the impact assessment and licensing decision. But even the licensing decision itself is a staged process. So we would get, at some point, a license to construct. And that would allow us to go underground. And when we're underground, we're excavating rooms and tunnels. We have an additional opportunity in the rock itself in a variety of ways to further look at the rock and make sure that it has the properties and provides the protection that we want. And we have to have that information again before we go back to the CNSC and get a license to operate, which would be the step that we'd have to do before we'd be able to put any used fuel underground. So there's a variety of things that we will be looking at to get that confidence that we are protecting the environment. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Paul. And so, Bernane, if you want to close our conversation about water and water safety, I'd like to move on to the transportation in the next 3 minutes. So it would be great if you can handle that.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. So I want to go back to Nancy's comments and description of how the monitoring would take place. And I think that with respect to the monitoring for the used fuel packaging plant, I think that we can have reasonable confidence, assuming that there's adequate monitoring stations and detail and attention for both the liquid releases and the air releases from the used fuel packaging plant. We should be able to have reasonable confidence that the monitoring will tell us what's leaving that operation. I think with the deep geological repository, it's much more challenging. And I like this idea, this goal, this ideal that there would be a rock areas or area or areas sufficiently large that there would be where fractures are disconnected to the surface. I think that's also highly improbable. And I think that we need to keep in mind that the crystalline rock formations are extremely varied, high abundance of fractures, and we also need to keep in mind that a disturbed site is different from an undisturbed site. So you might have a batholith that has some real strong features of homogeneity, consistency, and so on. When you disturb that site, when you put 3 shafts and numerous tunnels, and then you blast out the caverns off each of those tunnels, you've got a highly disturbed site. And that level of disturbance increases that level of fracturing, which is already, I think, a pretty natural attribute for crystalline rock formations. I think the difficulty with the deep geological repository in monitoring is that it's very difficult to predict the direction of release through any of those fractures. The NWMO early on, and I'm sorry I've lost track of the dates of these, but early on they had a monitoring program that was very simplistic. It was, drop some boreholes, put a sensor in, every 20 years pull the sensor out, read it, replace it. Some years later there was something along the lines of towards a framework for the development of a monitoring program. I don't think we've seen anything detailed on monitoring since that report, and that was a number of years ago, and I think it's a really big gap. I think it's a really big challenge. When you think sort of our traditional or typical way of monitoring what's occurring at depth, you would think of doing something like that very early preliminary plan of putting some boreholes down and put monitoring. But every time you disturb that site, you're actually increasing the opportunity for fractures, and so increasing the opportunity for releases. So I think it's a really, really big challenge for the NWMO to come up with not only a convincing plan or approach to monitoring, to effective monitoring, particularly at depth. It's not only that, the regulator and the public and the First Nations in the region have to be convinced it actually has to work. And I think that that remains to be seen.
I appreciate it. And so before I move on to my last question about transportation, I just want to open up quickly to the panel. If anyone had some closing notes on water, very brief. We're okay? All right. So Eric, I appreciate your patience. You've been sitting there so quietly. Could you please introduce yourself and your role at the CNSC? Remind us of that, please. And then I have a nice burning question for you.
Sure, thanks, Ethan, no problem. And it's very engaging discussion, so no problem to waiting until the end. My name is Eric Lemoyne. I'm the Director of Transport Licensing and Strategic Support in the Director of Nuclear Substance Regulation at the CNSC. So what does that mean? So when it comes to sort of this file, let's say we actually have the, and some of them are here in the room today, I introduced them earlier today, but the people that do the assessments and the recommendations for certification of certified packages, not just for used fuel, but all types of certified packages. And we also have transport officers who are inspectors and would inspect the licensees and the carriers to make sure they're meeting the requirements of our packaging our transport regulations.
Thank you. And so with respect to that, how different would the transportation of spent nuclear fuel be from any of the active nuclear materials currently licensed to be transported in Canada? And if the risk is not the same, is there a plan to modify or update the requirements for certification? I can break that down into just the single questions if you'd like.
No, I think it's okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start and then eventually get to answer your questions at the end.
It's been a lot of that.
So when it comes to transport safety, there's varying levels, and it starts with international requirements, which have been developed over the last 60 years. And what's interesting about this is that, well, in Canada, we do transport used fuel now. It's typically in small quantities and not that often. Nothing what we're talking about here, what NWMO is planning on doing in the future in terms of frequencies and amounts. However, there are other countries around the world who are transporting significant amounts of used fuel, and they are involved with the IEA to help refine and develop these international regulations. So then the next layer is our domestic regulations, which reference these international regulations. And the basic premise of transport safety is that the safety relies heavily on the design of the packages themselves. The design requirements are commensurate with the risk that the material, the nuclear substance being transported poses, with higher risk material requiring more robust packaging. So more specifically to he disappeared. He's gone. To Ethan's question, the package design is based on what the nuclear substance is, and its quantity and its form. So the way that we do this is we're actively involved with the IEA on those international regulations. We don't believe there's any changes necessary right now to the certification requirements for the packages, but we sit on that Safety Standards Committee, it's called, and we have the opportunity to vote on whether or not we think this needs to go into another revision cycle. In fact, that vote is coming up in this fall, where we will look at all the proposals to make changes to the international regulations and determine whether or not we agree. It's not just Canada, obviously there's a whole bunch of other countries represented on this. So we'll go through that process. The latest revision actually was in 2018 of the international standards, which we've referenced into our packaging and transport of nuclear substance regulations. So I'll leave it for there for now.
I appreciate that. Brene, before the panel, you indicated to me that you would like a moment to talk about the transportation concerns, and then I'm going to flip it back to the panel for discussion. So go ahead.
Sure, thanks. Just very briefly. So I just wanted, and this was sparked by earlier comments, I think, I wanted to note that there is a record of accidents. There's, CNSC reports on accidents. They've reported 5 accidents between 2016 and 2018. Transport Canada reported 34 what they call radiological emergencies between 2015 and 2019. Internationally, there are accidents. We have accidents that might be classified as international but had origin in Canada. 2017, there was a shipment from Chalk River to Savannah River with high-level liquid radioactive waste, and it was found to be hot on arrival at Savannah River. Meaning it was above the allowable radiation limits. There'd been an earlier incident with the same kind of package, or a package made by the same manufacturer, an incident at the Chalk River Laboratory, an earlier incident with the caddy coming out of that container. So there are accidents. There have been accidents. There's a record of accidents internationally where there's certainly a lot more experience in shipment of high-level radioactive waste, and there's a larger log of accidents internationally. I also just wanted to, flag this issue around package design, package certification, and package testing. And I want to say that there is not a record that we've been able to uncover of actual full-scale testing of the kind of package that the NWMO is proposing. Now, the NWMO has 3 different packages. They're talking about the basket container is still a concept stage. Then there's the DSC, and the one they talk about the most frequently is the used fuel transportation package. And almost a year ago, we did an access to information request asking for disclosure of the full-scale testing that had been done of that package. We have, almost a year later, we've received 91 pages of a 3,464-page record that the CNSC, we understand, to have assembled. The other 3,000 and some pages are still going through review as to whether or not they'll be released to the public. In those pages that we've had, in the 91 pages so far, there's no indication of a full-scale test. There's an indication of a half-scale test in the 1980s at Chalk River, and there's indication of some 1/7 scale testing that has been done. So I think we need to be really cautious about the confidence that we place in the packaging design and the packaging testing to date. It may be that there has been full-scale testing. It may be that there will be. But to date, there is no record available to the public to date that that kind of testing has taken place. And there is, even on the public record, evidence of a whole host of transportation accidents. So we have to just be very cautious as to how we look at the record around transportation and transportation risk.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And before I move on to my next question, I just want to give the panel an opportunity to speak. Kimberly, if you would like to weigh in, go ahead.
Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you. I do look to you, Carrie, for your head nod. Thank you. I did just want to talk a little bit about how transportation risk is measured. If you poll 100 people about the riskiest way to travel, it's very unlikely that in North America, most of those people would say to you, by personal automobile. However, by personal automobile is in fact the riskiest way to travel based on the statistics. And there are a number of characteristics that go into a risk number. For example, things like driver training, driver skills, driver attention. The volume of traffic as well in North America is also a factor when you're looking at overall risk. I don't have an exact number, but I can tell you that thousands of trucks both cross the Canada-US border on an average day, and also drive the highways in Northern Ontario. For folks from Northern Ontario, it's certainly not uncommon to see highways closed in Northern Ontario, either due to traffic accidents or because of bad weather. When considering the issue of transportation risk, I would really encourage folks to not just consider that accidents have happened, but to place that in the bigger picture, that accidents have happened, that many of those accidents had no measurable consequence, meaning that the environment or people or security was not damaged as a result. And I would also encourage people to consider how many transportation occurrences happen. How many times does a truck drive that specific route in a day or in a week, depending on the time period that you're using? And then place that risk in terms of the bigger picture, and then use that to ask good questions. For example, in Northern Ontario, when there's a big truck accident, the highway is closed and there is one road. If that highway is closed, it can't be closed for 2 weeks. So a question to ask would be, what's the plan to safely clear any incident, ensure that the environment is not damaged, and ensure that traffic can get moving again? Because it does not take very long in Northern Ontario before grocery store shelves start to go empty when the highway is closed for an extended period of time. Another way to ask about the transportation risk would be to ask about where the response teams for accidents will be positioned. How quickly can a response team make it to a location? If a response team has to fly from Toronto to Thunder Bay and then drive the 4 hours to Dryden, is a lot different than if there's a team already positioned somewhere in the vicinity. So those are some questions that can be asked on the transportation front. In a sense, it's not surprising that test data for the NWMO's specific containers don't exist yet, since at the conceptual phase of engineering is not when you would normally run those types of tests. A full-scale prototype has likely not been built, and that's possibly an explanation for why those tests have not been done. A question you could ask related to testing is, you could say, can you walk me through the test plan for the containers that are being proposed for transporting used nuclear fuel? And if those test plans aren't currently available, the next follow-up question could be, when will those plans be available, and how can people request that a copy be sent to them when they are available? So being able to arm yourself with questions about the transportation risk to make sure that there's a full understanding. And the reason that I hit on this point is a big one. Certainly here in Southern Ontario, we see certain types of electricity that are not desired by residents, and there's lots of signs protesting those types of electricity. Some of those types are renewable types of electricity. And when we can't agree on where to put our waste, there's definitely a risk that we may start having to look at the future of energy generation in the province of Ontario. And once we're in that space, you get into other questions like, should Ontario rely more heavily on natural gas? Should Ontario revert to a coal generation for electricity? And those are bigger questions than just, should we transport nuclear fuel to Northern Ontario? So there is a much bigger picture to be aware of and to think critically about, rather than one piece, which is the transportation risk piece. So I do want to encourage folks to look more broadly in addition.
I appreciate that, Kimberly. And before we move on to my next question, I just wanted to give Carrie the floor in case she had any follow-up points regarding transportation regulations. And if not, I will move on.
Thanks, Ethan. Just doing a time check. I think it kind of segues into some closing remarks I had planned, but I'm happy to share a few thoughts now if that's better timing-wise.
That works for me.
Okay, great. Yeah, in regards to the transportation discussion, I would just like to remind everyone in the audience and that when Canada began producing nuclear energy in the 1960s, there was no plan for decommissioning. There was no plan for nuclear waste. We didn't even understand the full dangers of radiation, you know, for instance, for the workers in the uranium mines or the levels of toxicity. And where we stand today is that we still lack a comprehensive framework for dealing with nuclear waste, its disposal and its oversight similarly. And so while I hear that, you know, community members are being faced with these questions that transportation is not just a transportation question, but actually one about Ontario's energy future, I also find it deeply troubling that when public groups or individuals are trying to get answers to their questions, disclosure isn't being provided in full, because that loops back directly to a lack of environmental justice. And you can't fully participate if you don't have the full information and questions in front of you. And so I would just like to remind those in the audience that these are critical questions to be asking, you know, for everyone along the transportation corridor route, that if this, you know, do these risks and do these questions you have to ask yourself, does it justify the continued use of nuclear power in Ontario? CELA is a founding member of Nuclear Waste Watch, and we are a proponent for advocating for renewable technologies, and modeling has shown that that is viable, and Ontario can, you know, phase out coal and get off nuclear when Pickering is decommissioned, such that renewables can fill that gap. And so again, on the transportation issue, thinking about the corridor, is there emergency preparedness around along that route? Will first responders be protected from radiation doses? Are absolutely critical questions to be asking. And Kim also provided some helpful questions to kind of get at those answers. And to Renee's earlier comment about disclosure not being in full, it's really helpful to keep a track of the questions you ask and then what wasn't answered. Because again, that's a critical piece to ensuring that there is engagement with the public.
Thank you. Eric, did you have one closing point?
I don't think it was one closing point,
But apologies.
I can try to make it brief. So, I mean, I agree a lot with what was said, right? So these are excellent questions that we need to ask the proponent. They need to make sure that they include those in the answers in those submissions. I would like to talk, so accidents, they do happen. We report on them. They are required to be reported to us. We post them publicly in our RORs. I've received your comment about, can you put it all in one place? We're looking at that. There is some transparency issues as well that we're looking at. Again, sort of inspired by you, Bernayne, to a certain extent. So the ATIP that did come in, we did provide a lot of the documents that were requested. However, there is commercial and security things that we need to consider as well when it comes to come to that. So, however, one of the things that we're proposing to do is look at other like-minded countries and their certification processes and what they make publicly available and not, and then seeing if we can improve ours. It won't be in the short term in terms of months or years, but or months or anyway.
Centuries?
No, not decades or centuries, but so you brought up these points to us in the past, and we are definitely looking at that. But yeah, these are all excellent questions. But I just want to reassure people that we are trying to be as transparent when it comes to accidents as possible. They're all listed publicly each year. It's just that they're spread out through 3 or 4 different RORs. And typically, what we see in Canada anyway, I can't speak to all the international results, Bernayne, but they're typically what we call like on the lower consequence or lower safety significance side. Oh, sorry, I was using ROR. It's a regulatory oversight report. This is an annual report that we issue on multiple different facilities or groups of facilities. Yeah, typically what we see, again, these are reported in the annual report, is events involving sort of mild damaging to the package through normal wear and tear, for example. And the other one as well, which is, sorry, I'm just checking my notes here. Oh, and minor motor vehicle accidents. Because every accident has to be reported to us, even fender benders and minor motor vehicle accidents are reported to us. Typically, there's zero damage at all to the package at all. It's not even displaced from its storage location in the back of the truck. But typically, these are very minor. Don't get me wrong, we have had some more serious events in Canada in the past, but those would all be reported in our RORs in recent history. That's it.
Yeah, I think we would all prefer that the accidents are over-reported than under-reported with respect to damage, but I appreciate you following up on that. Dr. Ottensmeyer, I want to apologize for earlier opening up a can of worms with the SMR conversation, but if I were sitting in the crowd right now and I saw your talk earlier, I would like to hear you weigh in about what the transportation implications are of the proposed reprocessing. And so if someone out there was in support of what you were presenting, what would they need to know about the implications of transportation of used nuclear fuel?
Well, I would have to admit that I hadn't really looked at transportation, except early on when I was thinking about subduction and using boreholes in the subduction zones. One would have to cross many provinces, and provinces just wouldn't allow nuclear materials to cross their territory, and so you're sort of stuck with Ontario. And in this particular case, since you asked for a thought of transportation, my initial thought was, well, if we're going to transport the material here for a deep geological repository, then that would be no different as to transport it here to be recycled. And so in that sense, then I wondered how best to transport it. And trucks, if I remember reading the literature, they're concerned about radiation exposure of the driver and of the population when the truck stops somewhere and so forth. And then in driving up from Thunder Bay with my daughter, she said, did I take the train along that track that runs along here, up to Sioux Lookout and so forth, out west to Vancouver and so forth. And then I wondered whether train transportation might not be more appropriate, even if it's slow. For instance, we drive from Toronto to Dryden in about 17 hours at 100 kilometers per hour. If you take a train and run it at 10 kilometers per hour, it would take a week to get here. At 5 kilometers an hour, it would take 2 weeks to get here. So would that make it safer? And then you can transport a tremendous amount in one go. If you have to rest someplace to let other trains pass, there are sidings, I would imagine. So I haven't heard anyone propose that because I think most of the time you think of transporting a single package or something like this. But if you're transporting en masse, then train travel should be looked at.
I appreciate you, thank you. Before we end today, I've been warned of a hard 8 o'clock cutoff. I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to give some closing remarks with respect to the conversation we had today. With respect to questions and answers, I'm going to work with Tyler on facilitating a little bit of an online forum where some of our guests will be able to answer these questions in written response for you. But to keep our conversation succinct and in respect of everyone's time, I would like to offer the panel an opportunity for closing remarks. I'll work my way down the table and then head online. And so, Nancy, before we go, if there's anything that you wanted to touch on about what we spoke about today.
I think I'd just like to close by saying we don't prescribe waste management facilities or activities. It's up to the license application to come to the regulator with those. We are not pro or against any project. I would say we're pro-safety. And our goal is to be an open and transparent regulator and to disseminate scientific information we have. We hope people can feel they can reach out to us if they have questions, if they're looking for information. We will be here again tomorrow, and we can share our information where you can reach out to us for information requests. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to come here.
I'm not going to add very much, maybe just touch on the rail, and similarly to what Nancy said, is that we don't prescribe the routes or the mode of transport. That's up to the proponent to explain to us and show that the safety case demonstrates that during transport that the material is safe.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the good discussion this evening. I think I'd summarize by saying the difficulty is in the details. You know, this is a very complex and detailed and frequently changing set of proposals. And it's not the first time around the block. The industry has been making proposals of this sort for decades now. In Canada, we had one, then another by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. Now NWMO came out in 2005. It's changed a number of times in pretty fundamental ways over the last 17 years. So I think that makes it really challenging for members of the public to really track those details, understand the project, dig down into the details. But I think that there's no avoiding that for the people of Treaty 3 territory where there is a proposal active in the area. We just have to do the work. But I think that there is a reason, you know, since 1957, I think, the idea of a deep geological repository was first presented in the United States. There is a reason that still, more than half a century later, there is no operating deep geological repository anywhere in the world. And yes, the NWMO will tell us there's a number of proposals. Well, there have been a number of proposals for decades now. There's a reason, and the reason is uncertainty. And I would encourage us to all view this project through that lens. Can you have confidence? I've been looking at iterations of this project since the late 1980s, and I don't have confidence. I'm not ideologically opposed. I am practically unpersuaded. Thank you.
For the patience with us. I just want to remind too that we're in a site selection process right now. NWMO doesn't decide whether we're going to build the DGR or not. We're just sort of picking a site at this point in time. And I think the citizens of Dryden truly, you know, will have a say on this once we move into the next phase. So don't worry, your voices will be heard. But there's one voice that we haven't talked a lot about today, and that's the Indigenous population in Northern Ontario. They will be the key decision makers, and particularly Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation will be a key decision maker for this project. And you know, it's complicated. You know, we have the duty to consult, we have the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, Section 29.2, that says no hazardous waste should come into traditional territory of Indigenous people without their pre-prior informed consent. We have that, you know, we recognize that. You know, we have to incorporate TK into this, and we also have to respect traditional laws. One of the key traditional laws in here, something called Manituakia Nakagawan, is the law of, it's the resource law as part of Grand Council Treaty 3. So certainly we're working with Grand Council Treaty 3 on that. We've already had to consult with the communities, the Indigenous communities here in the Northwest on our borehole drilling and some good conversations, some difficult conversations, but certainly we are engaged with right now about 13 different communities, either through consultation or through learn more agreements. So certainly, to me, that's where I see there's a lot of work that needs to be done And certainly we're up to the task of doing that work. One last thing I'll leave you with, and I think this is what I really like about these sessions, and I really like about this panel. One of our principles for engagement is called cause no harm. We actually have 3, but the one is cause no harm. This is a very controversial project. It instills outrage in people. People come to this conversation, I see it every day, angry, upset, fearful, and that can divide people, it can divide families, it can divide communities. And so what's important to me is that we have this conversation in a way that tries to lessen that divide and pay attention to that. And I'm always looking for opportunities. How do we have these conversations in a good way? I think this is one of them, so that we can hear all the different voices, all the critical voices that we need to hear. So thank you very much for your time. Emma.
Well, I'd like to say thank you for the invitation to come up here. It's been a real pleasure. To make a categorical statement, I think I'm very much pro-nuclear. I'm not sitting on a fence. So, was it CNSC? I think you should be one way or another. You're responsible. You have nuclear in your CNSC thing. So you've got to be for it. Nuclear is the densest energy resource we have in the world. Whatever we decide, it won't affect me at all because I'm too old. But we take care of our grandchildren 3 times a week. And so that motivates me to find an energy resource for that group of individuals and your grandchildren, which is virtually permanent. And nuclear does that. So basically talking about nuclear waste and putting it down someplace is throwing away 99% of that potential. So I'm definitely against doing that. It doesn't matter whether it's safe or not. It's not the right thing to do. And so, to give you an example, we have about 3 million tons of uranium that we've mined. We've used maybe 20,000 of that to create energy. If we use the rest of it, that will create $300,000 worth of electricity for every person on Earth, not just in the nuclear states, for every person on Earth. That's what we're looking at. And so I don't think we should be looking at burial. We should be looking at how to use that and to use it safely. Turn it into fission products, that's good. They're perfectly normal atoms anyway, and their radioactivity will decay in a short time. You won't have the long-term million-year problem if you go in that direction. So Dryden, get yourself a reactor and run it.
Thank you, Dr. Ottensmeyer. I'd like to pass it to Carrie and then to Kimberly. And since Paul, and since you're here in support, I think we'll just end it after that if you're okay with that. So, Carrie, go ahead.
Thanks, Ethan. And thanks to Dryden for putting this event on and for the invitation to attend. I would just like to conclude by saying the NWMO, as we know, is the directors are the giant utility companies that we all get our power from, including myself. And so because of that, I think there's an inherent openness and willingness to be more trusting because we know these utility companies, we get power from them already. But in this instance, there are also those who produce the waste that we're now considering today. And so I think we need to set aside our assumptions and this trust that we might have to begin with, and actually, in assuming that all will be fine, they know what they're doing. If it wasn't a good idea, it wouldn't be proposed. And instead ask the hard questions. And this is a first, not only for Canada, but globally. And to my co-presenter's point about the CNSC needing to be a promoter of nuclear power, ironically, it used to be. It was actually in its statute when it was formed over 50 years ago. But we have learned since then that when the regulator becomes beholden to the industry it regulates, then it can become a captured regulator, and that can actually decrease safety. And the Fukushima Daiichi accident was most telling of that, where that accident was actually found to be a man-made accident because of industry and regulator collusion. But getting back to this evening, again, thank you. And I guess my closing tips are, if you're a municipality, seek peer review from independent experts and academics who are not from industry but are independent. If you're a citizen, public participation absolutely matters. You have a right to participate and a right to that information. Those are your environmental rights. And they are found in a number of statutes in Canada, and also they are principles of international law. Your willingness cannot be manufactured. My thanks for having me today, and you're welcome to reach out anytime, virtually, email. Thanks again, Ethan.
Thank you. And before I close, Kimberly, if you want to give us some closing remarks, and then we'll call it a night.
Can you hear me, Carrie? Great. In my closing thoughts, I want to express my gratefulness for allowing me to share my thoughts with each of you tonight. I'm humbled to share this panel space with the panelists that are here tonight. They each truly bring an amazing part of themselves to this discourse. I am a professional engineer, and I have worked in the nuclear power industry for a number of years. And although I am very careful to never express my personal opinion in any of the sessions I have done in Dryden, I will share an opinion tonight. And my opinion is that decisions like these are often made in the political sphere and not in the technical sphere. And in the sphere of politics, all of the excellent arguments that can be logically expressed and put forward often become very blurry and gray. And it's for that reason that it is imperative that you stay curious. There is no question that is too small to ask, and there is no time that you are too small to make a difference. I would encourage you to ask every question that comes to mind and to keep asking until you get those answers. Engage with your politicians and make sure that they know your stance, or at least they don't have an excuse to not know your stance. And I encourage every person to take that same approach. Stay curious. And if everyone comes at an issue from the place of love for their community and for their fellow citizens, the idealist in me really believes that things will work out in the best way that they were meant to. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And before I close for the night, I was hoping that we could all briefly thank our panelists for coming and express our gratitude. I think for me, and all of the questions that were compiled and that I tried to put together in the best way possible to communicate your concerns to them, my biggest takeaway from this discussion was just how honest all of these people were about their commitment and their care for their communities, whether it's anecdotes about their grandparents or the communities they grew up in. I really appreciate all of you for that. And it's reflective of what I want to do with my life. This is my third time coming to one of these events with respect to the Deep Geological Repository here in Dryden. This is my first time holding this role, but I wanted to bring the spirit of a teacher to all of this, where I truly want all of the questions that about your hill, the thing that you know that no one else knows about your community. I wanted to make sure that they were brought forward as honestly as possible. And I really appreciate your guys' commitment to answering those questions honestly today. So I think that brings our first day of the Dryden Nuclear Forum to a close. Scott, if you wanted to send us home, that would be great. But I appreciate you guys for having me. I couldn't have been more excited to come to Dryden. And I hope everyone gets home safe tonight. Thank you.
Big thank you to Ethan for moderating the panel and all the panelists, both in person and virtually. So that, like Ian said, concludes day one. We covered a lot of ground today. We heard from a lot of speakers on a wide variety of topics, and I hope everybody can walk away with a little bit of value from this. So we will resume tomorrow, 8 a.m., coffee and snacks. The speakers and their colleagues will be at their booths if you have any specific questions for them. I believe Trevor's put up a QR code for feedback for this particular session. With your feedback, you can ask questions. We will make sure that we reach out to the groups and have your questions answered in written form and make sure that you receive those answers. So we'll see everybody tomorrow at 8 a.m. And again, thank you all for attending, and thank you all the panelists and the speakers today for your presentations.